Excited to have a speaker today from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Adria Kimbrough. And she's going to talk today about opportunity. And the opportunities that she describes may not be exactly the right one for you, but it's also an opportunity to learn about one of the most significant and important civil rights organizations in our country. And it's an impactful time where you have witnessed the importance of social justice. This is an organization that is historically immersed in some of the most significant social justice causes in our history. And there's an opportunity for those of you who might be interested in a social justice related career to have funding, support, and all the institutional advantages of being supported by the NAACP. So, Adria, welcome. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad y'all spoke back to me. You know, you never know if people are going to say anything back. It's great to be here. It is wonderful to see you here right before Thanksgiving. There are a million other places that you could be, so I'm glad that we have this time together. It's interesting, too, the timing, I guess, of this conversation that I hope we'll have conversation together. Because if you are like me, maybe a few moments ago, you got an alert on your phone. I don't know if anyone got a news alert on their phone. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Yes, you're brave to raise your hand. What is the alert on your phone? Simone, right? Yeah. Simone, what's the alert that you got on your phone?
Kyle Rittenhouse was just found not guilty on all charges.
Yes, so if anyone has been following the Kyle Rittenhouse case, or if you just happen to have news alerts on your iPhone and your team iPhone, you got the same alert that many of us got about this decision. And it's interesting, the timing, because it was right before I walked in here. And regardless of how you feel about the outcome, these notifications seem to be happening more and more, perhaps. You know, if we look at history, we may argue otherwise, but it's just another reminder of just how important the work and how relevant the work of civil rights and racial justice is in this nation. But before we do that, I want to, I guess, first just thank you all. Thank you for the invitation and allowing me to come here. I was just amazed, and I wanted to highlight this, the grand challenge, this question, I think, that was posed for the lecture series this year that I saw online, this notion of pivoting and how purpose and perseverance can lead to success. I certainly think we can all think about instances for ourselves where that's the case, and I think even more so if we look at the course of civil rights in this nation and the history of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that I have the honor to work with, you can see constantly pivot, and perseverance. It's the only way that progress is made. But before we talk a little bit about that, I want to tell you a little bit about me. Now, there's a 3-minute remaining rectangle over that picture that you see, but underneath it, hopefully you see a little girl that looks kind of like me. I mean, it's been a while. You can tell it's the 70s. You can see the coloring of the picture that this is the 70s, right? But this is me. So I think I'm probably about 4 years old in this picture. I am originally from Mobile, Alabama. And I don't know if you know anything about Mobile, Alabama, but it was a pretty great place to grow up, more or less. But I was a kid. I don't know how many people who are in here who have notions about law school. But even early on, people were saying to me, you should really be a lawyer. I talked a lot, a whole lot. You may probably can tell that right now. I talked a lot. I was the kind of kid that asked a lot of questions and always asked why and always wanted a reason for why I couldn't do whatever the thing was. And so people thought, well, maybe you should be a lawyer. It was also interesting because of the time that I was growing in. And I don't have that much gray hair. I try to cover it up as much as I can. But I like to think I'm still relatively young in the grand scheme of things. But you'll see here some of the things that my hometown of Mobile, Alabama is known for. So you see there's the azaleas, you know, we are on the Gulf Coast. And also, now I currently live in New Orleans. My friends in New Orleans would disagree with me on this, but history shows that Mobile, Alabama is the birthplace of Mardi Gras. Did you know that? You're being polite. Some people are nodding yes. You're thinking it's New Orleans, but it really, really isn't. It's Mobile. So it's a great place to grow up in a lot of ways. But there's also some complicated history in the city of Mobile that sort of shaped my perspective and ties in to some of the other things that we talked about. So you may not be able to see this completely, but this is an article from the newspaper in Mobile, Alabama, about a man here, Michael Donald, who was lynched about 3 miles away from where I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, who was lynched by the Klan. This was in the 80s, believe it or not. It's the last reported Klan lynching in the United States. Some of you all may have seen there was a documentary on CNN about this case, I think earlier in the summer. And so it made national news for obvious reasons. And the interesting thing is that the mother of Michael Donald sued the Klan, and she won. You'll see that article, the New York Times Magazine on the left, that this woman, who I think made high school education, sued the Klan and won. You'll see her flanked there by her lawyers, one who some may recognize as Morris Dees with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the other, Michael Donald, who is deceased now but was a local lawyer. And for me, it was so transformational because this notion that something like this could happen and there's something you can do about it. Like, you can really sue the Klan and you can win. And the result was that the Klan ended up filing bankruptcy after this lawsuit because they just couldn't pay the bill. And so that was certainly impactful. And so another interesting piece of this, sort of my history growing up in Mobile, Alabama, is this intersection with the great woman on the left. I'd be curious to see if anyone knows and is brave enough to say who they think this woman might be. And actually, it's my left, your right. It's not an easy one. It's not an easy one. So on the right is Constance Baker Motley. The introduction, you heard about me working with a program. The name of the program that I work with is the Marshall-Motley Scholars Program, which is a program that's sponsored by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Constance Baker Motley did desegregation work all through the South, desegregating schools. And on the right-hand side, there's a young woman by the name of Bertie Mae Davis. And Constance Baker Motley filed a lawsuit in Mobile, Alabama to desegregate the schools after Brown versus Board. As a result of that lawsuit, I was able to go to the schools that I was able to go to because I was able to file for a transfer, and it changed the trajectory of my life. Constance Baker Motley is the first Black woman to be a federal judge. As well, she worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for many, many, many years. So, went on, graduated from college, went to law school, and the rest is history, if you will. But I certainly, and I'm happy to answer questions about this, but the idea of this pivot really resonated with me. I certainly have done that over the course of my career, and it has made for a lot of joyful experience over the course of my career. So now let's shift. So talked a little bit about myself, and now I want to talk to you a little bit about, I guess, sort of this notion of pivoting and perseverance from Heman Sweat to George Floyd. I'd be curious to know if anyone knows who Heman Sweat is. We're on a roll here, Simone. Tell me a little bit about it.
I really hope I don't do this wrong. He wanted to go to the University of Texas Law School, but at the time it was segregated, and he filed. The case was Sweat versus Painter, and he sued for his because he was saying that the separate but equal of like segregation wasn't actually equal, and so he should, because there was no black law school on the same level as the University of Texas Law School, and so he ended up winning, and he was able to attend law school.
Oh, listen, we should just invite you up here, and you can share this with the class. No, this is great. The reason, and there are lots of cases, there's lots of civil rights history, but what you may not know is that Heman Sweat was right here in Houston, Texas. And as Simone mentioned, decided he wanted to become a lawyer. But it's a really interesting path. And then, of course, I mean, we all know George Floyd and know the ties that he had to Houston as well. So those two, to me, just really stood out. And really, when you think about it, again, going back to this notion of perseverance, what was happening at the time that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was founded in 1940, this notion of really dismantling Jim Crow. Like, it was really audacious when you think about it. You're talking about really moving a mountain. There are laws on top of laws that created lack of access and barriers to democracy for African Americans in this nation. And it really, to me, was a magical idea, this notion that Thurgood Marshall, who I think you may know, we'll talk about, decided to found this organization, the notion that African Americans could be engaged and lead the liberation of their own people. I found this one. This is from Barbara Johns, who was involved in desegregation efforts in Virginia. It's like it seemed like we were reaching for the moon. And certainly, in some ways, it seemed impossible. There's certainly things today that seem impossible. Lord knows the last year or so that we've had in this pandemic, many things have seemed impossible. But the fact that you all are here, like I was talking to a student earlier, I think it was Simone, who this is her first year. It's her second year, but it's her first year because nobody was on campus last year. And so I think about the ways in which you all have persevered as well, and sometimes things seem impossible, but again, there are plenty of examples to show us more. So Thurgood Marshall, most of you all know him probably from the Supreme Court. You probably have heard of him, but he's also the founder of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And the Legal Defense Fund is the nation's first and premier civil rights law firm in this nation, committed to working on behalf of racial justice. And we've been true to this commitment. And you think about Brown versus Board, but it started way before that, which goes back to what Simone shared about Heman Sweat. It's a very long road that required lots of pivoting and persevering to be able to dismantle Jim Crow. And that's the sort of a takeaway from me that kind of I hope ties into the theme that you've been discussing this year, is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. It was a long journey. And I think sometimes we can get discouraged, whether it be in our own personal lives or when we think about issues of racial justice, that, well, why isn't the progress, why isn't it moving faster? When you think about the ways, the intentional ways in which the approach to the civil rights and dismantling Jim Crow happened, it was very methodical, very intentional, and very slow, if you will, marathon. So this is Heman Sweat. Simone talked about him a little bit. One of the things that I did not realize about him, at the time that he stepped forward to apply to law school, he was 32 years old. So he wasn't, right out of high school into college. He had a career already in the U.S. Postal Service. And I would say he was minding his own business. Maybe he wasn't minding his own business. Maybe he already had a proclivity for this kind of thing. But there was a woman, Lulu White, with the NAACP here in Houston, who was speaking at this church, Wesley Chapel, and he was there. They were trying to find a plaintiff because Thurgood Marshall, one of the first areas they wanted to start with was education. And they started with higher education first because they felt that that would be somewhat easier road to go. And so she's in the church explaining the case. They're looking. They've considered several others, haven't found a proper plaintiff. And then Heman Sweat steps forward and says, I'll do it. Which, again, when you think about it, man of his age, his wife, children, that's a tremendous risk. A lot of times when you look back to the civil rights movement, it's young people. Like, I'd like to think 32 is young, but I mean, it's all relative. It's all relative. But certainly those were not always the people that you saw step forward because you have a lot to lose. When you have a job working for the federal government, you've got a wife, you have children, you've got all of these things to consider. And yet he decided to persevere and step forward. And so the story, I'd want to, and we don't have enough time to sort of completely unpack it, but I think it's important to know that it's not that he just woke up one day and decided he wanted to go to the University of Texas and it just happened, because that was not the case. In fact, those who have studied this talk about the fact that Thurgood Marshall, when they filed the lawsuit, they knew they would lose in Texas. They already knew, like that was a foregone conclusion. And so you think about the idea of going into a battle that you know you're going to lose, right? Like you go in knowing that this is going to be a loss, right? But it's, you can lose a battle and win the war. And so thinking about it from a much broader standpoint, perspective, like I'm not playing the short game, I'm playing the long game, understanding that it's going to take some of those losses to eventually get to the end of success. And that's exactly what happened. But it took about 4 years or so for that entire process to play out. If you're already 32, then that time goes on pretty quickly, and there are a lot of things to consider. But ultimately, he ends up going to law school. He registers and is the first to integrate the University of Texas at the law school. And again, just the level of sacrifice involved I think is just so important to mention. The other sort of, takeaway that I will highlight for you, and then I'll talk a little bit about the program, but is this power of partnerships. I think whether it be in the Sweat case or whatever aspect of the civil rights movement you consider, there were intentional partnerships that were important for the success. And one of those is this idea of these cooperating attorneys. And I just lift up just one here to you who is also based in Houston, Texas, Weldon H. Berry. So most people, generally speaking, know about Thurgood Marshall. They may not know a Weldon Berry or some of those attorneys who are in the local areas. But the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is based in New York. It's always been based in New York. But the work has been based in the South. So lawyers come to the South, do the work, and go back. But there has to be someone on the ground who people can access when they need it. And so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund worked with attorneys, cooperating attorneys, to be able to have those people on the ground to be able to partner with. And that's really the only way that things happened the way that they did. And there were cooperating attorneys all over the South, and the organization helped to develop and increase capacity to grow more, which actually ties to the program that I'm working with now. And so we know perhaps some of this, especially with all the black and white, it makes it seem very far away, like these are some things that may not have relevancy, but I think the last year has taught us a lot about where we are as a nation. Certainly we are much further than we've been, but there's still room to grow. And I think there's been a call, people have felt a call to do something, And so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund has been very, very busy in the last year, in many ways protecting the rights of those, and many of you perhaps felt the urge to be engaged in some way after the death of George Floyd, to be involved in being a part of the change that you want to see. And so now it is a new generation that is being called, I think, to decide the ways in which you will play a part in making our nation as good as its promise. The program, I'm going to try to jump ahead a little bit, and I'll play this, and you can get a sense, hopefully, of how the past now connects to the present with the work we're doing with this program.
In the civil rights movement's earliest days, Thurgood Marshall formed the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. For over 80 years, in courtrooms across the country, our attorneys have relentlessly fought for the rights we have today. Having those rights, keeping those rights that belong to every American takes work, commitment. It is indeed a calling. At a time when those rights are more threatened than ever, our work matters more than ever. That's why today, we are honored to introduce the very first Marshall-Motley Scholars. Named for our founder, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and the iconic litigator, Judge Constance Baker Motley. Scholars are from different backgrounds, yet share the same commitment: to uphold, maintain, and protect our civil rights, to answer the call and bring an end to racial injustice.
Racial justice and choice-filled lives are not mutually exclusive.
As long as I live to fight for freedom.
Racial justice in education is when Black students are provided with equitable access to quality public education.
In every space, my mission is also to connect with people in ways that ultimately create more just and inclusive communities.
Since the age of 11, I have been committed to fighting for equality and justice in the South.
In this society, poverty should not be criminalized.
I am in the fight for racial justice on behalf of Black people.
I hope to be a leader that is a connector between coalitions and builds efficacy in communities by using the law to fuel material change that is larger than me or what any one individual can do.
I intend to offer my voice, visibility, and ensure the experiences of my community.
It's about changing the narrative and the dynamic and the systemic outlook for African Americans.
Good evening. How are you, Ashley?
Hi, doing well. How are you all?
Doing wonderful. Doing wonderful.
Good to see you.
We really recognize how rigorous this process was. And it's one of the reasons why we wanted to just be able to talk to finalists personally. But I also wanted to reach out because I wanted to congratulate you on having been selected as a Marshall-Motley Scholar.
I'm not crying.
I'm not crying, you're crying. For having been selected as a Marshall-Motley Scholar.
Wait. I was sitting here, I was like, she finna tell me I didn't get it. The way she was going, she built me up. I was like,
Sherilyn Eiffel. Oh, hey there.
Well, how you doing?
Hi, how are you?
You
can unmute.
Unmute yourself.
You can unmute yourself now.
Thank you. That's really awesome news, especially 2 days before my graduation.
Yes, I would think.
I can't wait to get to work for the Marshall-Motley Scholars Program, and it's just an honor to be a part of the inaugural cohort.
Congratulations, Marshall-Motley Scholars. Now, let's get to work.
You may be wondering, why are these people screaming and crying on this video? And I want to talk to you a little bit about that so you can learn some about a program. It really is a return to some of the early days of the Legal Defense Fund's investment in the South. It's intentional, and you may say, well, there's issues happening all over the nation. Like, why the South? Why is there this focus on the South? Well, part of it is the history of the Legal Defense Funds and its efforts to support and to address issues of injustice for African Americans in this country. Believe it or not, even in 2021, the South is still where the majority of African Americans live. Certainly, there's been great migration, there are people all over, but the South is still where the majority of African Americans live. So the idea is to invest in this new generation of lawyers who are going to be able to address the issues of the time. And what we are going to do, and I'll pull this up so you can see, but the students who are in the program receive a full scholarship to law school. So that's part of the reason for the excitement. In addition to that full scholarship, they also receive the living expenses, so not just the full tuition, but also living expenses. They also receive paid internships during the summer with civil rights organizations, and then a 2-year fellowship following. Again, the idea is to provide them with the training that they will need to be able to do the work. In exchange for that, we look for a commitment of 8 years of practicing civil rights law in the South on behalf of Black communities. And it has really been just a joy, just very magical to be a part of this experience. The program is very new. This is the very first year. We launched in January on King Day and have since embarked upon selecting the first cohort who are now in their first year of law school. And the application is now open for the second cohort. So we are looking for that next group. I'm intentionally coming to some places perhaps that where we've not gotten students or where maybe we did not connect with in the first cycle, because we really want to make sure that the cohort is diverse and brings a perspective from all parts of our country, really, but with a commitment toward the South, towards racial justice. So I can answer more questions about the program or any other aspect of what we've already talked about, but I do want to pause here just to entertain any questions or thoughts that people may have. Any questions?
I've got a question. You
Yes.
talked about the civil rights history that emanated from Texas.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about lawyers who will practice in the South, what geographically does that mean? Does that include Texas?
Oh, this is a great question. So it does include the South, and I will pull up the map for you. There are 13 states. And it's an interesting question because the South means different things. There are some states initially I thought, I don't know that I would have, in my, Alabama perspective, would have thought of some of these states as the South, but I'm going to. Here we go. Oh, it's not. You all can't see. I'm so sorry. It's not connected. But the South, as we define it, is Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. So it does indeed include Texas. So if there are students who are here, who are from Texas, who have ideas that they would want to return, or just stay here, that's certainly something you can do. The other great thing I think about the program is because people assume that you have to go to law school in the South. And that is not the case. We have students who are in school in the South, but we also have students who are in school on the East Coast, as well as the West Coast. The other, to me, really remarkable thing about the program is that it covers the cost of tuition regardless of where you attend law school. So we have students at Yale and Harvard and Berkeley. But interesting, we actually have 2 students who are in law school here in Texas. We have one who is at Texas Southern University, Thurgood Marshall School of Law, and another who's at Texas Tech. And we've got people, you know, so it's really about identifying the law school that is the best fit for you. And whatever that is, wherever that is, this program will pay for the cost of attendance. Yes?
So I have a question too, and that is that, so do the students then, do they get accepted into law school and then apply to the program?
No. Well, it could happen in that sequence. However, so for example, now, you know, our application is open now. So there may be students who are still applying to law school, and that's okay. But to receive to be a part of the program, you have to have been accepted to an ABA accredited law school. So it's not something that you have to do before, you don't have to be accepted, but certainly by the time that we make the awards, you have to have been accepted to law school. Yes. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What was your pathway from law school to the Legal Defense Fund, and what recommendations might you have for students that are interested in pursuing such a career?
Great questions. All right, so I will, I guess I'll start with the first question. So my path, which is why the theme resonated for me so much, has been very much about the pivot. My very first job out of law school was not a legal job. It was in higher education. My very first professional job was as an assistant dean of students at Cornell University. So I did that for a few years. But the intention was to combine my interest with law and education. Because that is something, before getting to law school, I didn't know that, you know, I had a very sort of narrow view of what lawyers did, and that was quite frankly just based upon my exposure. I got to law school and determined and realized, oh, you can match law with just about anything, because there's no area of society, of business, of it. The law impacts every aspect of our lives when we don't even realize it. So after my first year of law school, I was like, I don't really know, this is not what I thought it was going to be, because all of the images of history, that is what fueled my interest in going to law school. And when I got there, I was like, some of this there seems to be a disconnect. And I think I know a number of people who felt that way. I had a great career services person who said, well, what are you interested in? And then she drew the line between those things and the law. And she said, you know, colleges and universities have lawyers, schools have lawyers. There's many ways in which you can combine those interests. And so that ended up being my goal. So after being in student affairs, I worked as a university attorney at a university in Georgia. I've also worked in the general counsel's office for the University of Arkansas. I've worked in private practice, just a number of things along the way. Lots and lots of pivots at different points. But as far as the connection to the Legal Defense Fund, it really stemmed from my work with students. So as an attorney, I'd always involved with students. It's a passion of mine to be able to mentor and support students. That evolved into pre-law advising. So I did that for about 5 years. And through that, ended up being invited to apply for this position with this program because I'd already been working with students, and this is just an opportunity to do that, but in the context of the Legal Defense Fund, which I will tell you, never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined. It was an organization that I knew about, that I revered, I knew the history, but you can never see far enough ahead to see the ways in which things will move. And so I'm grateful for that. your question about like what can students be doing now, I always say that you don't have to wait to become a lawyer to do the thing that you want to do. Now, let's be clear. We do not want you engaged in the unauthorized practice of law. So don't be out there trying to practice law as a student. There's the rules against that. However, if you're passionate about the environment, you don't have to wait to get a law degree to do that. If you're passionate about, gosh, who knows? I know I have a cousin who has combined her interest in law with the cosmetic industry. She's a cosmetic chemist, and so is using the law to do patents for makeup, like cosmetic companies. Like who knew that was a thing, right? But whatever it is, you don't have to wait. So for those who might be interested in this type of work, racial justice work, or with the Legal Defense Fund, start now. You can first look on your campus. I'm sure that there are efforts, organizations that you can get involved in. In addition to that, looking around in the city. I mean, Houston is a great city filled with all kinds of diverse opportunities. Find ways to get involved now. Number one, that'll help you figure out, is this something that you really want to do? Is this something that I want to commit my life's work to? But it will also, should you, at some point decide this is an opportunity that you want to pursue, now you have a record of commitment, because one of the things that we're looking for are students who have a demonstrated commitment to racial justice on behalf of Black communities in the South. That's the purpose of the program, it's the mission of the program. And so we're trying to hedge our bets in a way, right? Like if you heard the commitment piece that we talked about, overall, it's a 13-year commitment. Sounds like a long time. So it's 3 years of law school, there's a 2-year fellowship, and then there is the 8 years of practice, right? So you could probably shave the 3 years off, because if you're going to law school anyway, you're going to do that anyway. But needless to say, it's a commitment. And so our hope in the selection process is to identify those individuals who would have been doing this work anyway, right? You already have a mission or passion, and maybe the barrier was the finances. That's one of the reasons for this program. There are a number of people who go to law school with the idea that this is what they want to do. And the realities of the debt slap them in the face. Law school is a very expensive proposition. It's a very expensive proposition, and racial justice work is not always profitable. It can be profitable. You can make a good living doing it, but obviously in the private sector, there may be more lucrative opportunities. And so if you're already coming to the table with debt, and this then can become a barrier for you. So the idea behind the program is not only to help fill the South with this next generation of lawyers, but then also to be able to remove the barriers that often keep people from pursuing the calling that they have and going in a different direction. So I would say to you and anyone else who's interested in this program or this kind of work, just like start now. Thank you. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. And my question was, what are the most pressing civil rights concerns right now?
I feel like I should sit down. There are many. I can tell you what the focus is of the Legal Defense Fund. It's voting rights. It is criminal justice. It is economic opportunity, and it's education. That's the focus. And the hope, I think, is that it will touch, I think, all the aspects of life where we see inequity. But we know that there's more. I believe, we were talking about an organization now that's old, more than 80 years old. And I think some of that will expand. Maybe not in significant ways, but there's so much intersectionality, right? So you think about environmental justice. You think about, there are just many ways in which there are overlaps. You may think about even immigration and racial justice and how those things intersect. So they're just, I think the organization as storied as it is, and all of the legacy, I think, is well positioned to then evolve, if you will, given the issues that we confront today. But there's no shortage of things to focus on, but those are the areas that are the focal points for us right now. Thank you for your question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Jordan Reed. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Jordan.
And I have a question about, so I was under the impression that you have to sit for the bar in the state that you're going to practice in.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true based on, I guess, where the students go off to law school, or how does that work?
Yes, so you can go to law school in one state and take the bar exam in another state. So for example, I went to law school in Ohio. I've never practiced law in Ohio. I did not sit for the Ohio bar. I sat for the Alabama bar, I sat for the Georgia bar, I sat for the Arkansas bar and the Louisiana bar. And I do not recommend that you do that. That is just how my life worked out. And the wonderful thing is that you won't have to do that because there's a uniform bar exam. I came too soon. In the dark days, there were rules about how many years you had to practice before you could waive into another state. And I just came like shy of it, like every single time. It's like you've got to practice 5 out of 7 years, so I move on year 4. It just, I do not recommend that you take 4 bar exams. Now, the uniform bar exam, which is being adopted, I think Texas just adopted it recently, but almost all of the states, by the time you get there, probably everybody but Louisiana will be accepting uniform bar exam. It's one test, and once you pass it, you can practice in all of the states where they accept the uniform bar exam. So now maybe the question underneath your question is, well, if you go to, let's say you go to Yale, are you going to be prepared to take the bar exam in Georgia, right? And I think, common law it's common law. And so a lot of the things are pretty similar from state to state, and I'll say that as someone who has taken more than one exam. There are some state distinctions, but not enough to where you're going to be ill-prepared. So I think the conventional wisdom is that you might go to law school in the area that you're thinking about. I know many people who have taken a different path, myself included, and it's worked out pretty fine. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I thought I'd ask a question about your cohort, the first cohort.
Yes.
Were they from all over the United States, or were they from the southern states, or what?
Yes.
Because they could be passionate about racial justice and outside the southern states and interested in the program.
Absolutely, and certainly there are issues of racial justice outside of the South. It's funny though, and the question, if you didn't hear, was, what about our current cohort? Where are they from? They're all from the South. Now, we had people in the pool from all over. We had finalists who were not from the South. But part of it is, and it's open to anyone, but when you're looking for a commitment to the South and you're looking for a way to demonstrate that, I do think it might be a bit more challenging for someone who is outside of the South to do that. Can they do it? Yes. There's other ways to have connections. You may have family in the South. You may have, grown up somewhere else, and now you're in college in the South. I think there are a number of ways to make those connections, so it's not a zero-sum game. But when you think about the fact that we're looking for people who are going to work in the South for 8 years, again, we're trying to make a calculated decision about who do we believe has the best chance of fulfilling that commitment. But again, it's open to anyone. But if
Texas is considered the South.
Oh yes,
so
oh yes.
Talking to students who already live here.
This is why I'm here. This is why I'm here. I mean, certainly, again, applications from everywhere, but we really are being intentional about trying to cultivate interest and applicants in places like you're already here. So that suggests to me that you have some affinity for the South already. Now you may be some, I mean, and we see this, there's sometimes people grow up in the South and they want to leave. And that's okay, that's okay. But the program, we are looking for people who are at least going to make that commitment for the course of 8 years. And we'll see. We've got one cycle that we've had. It'll be interesting to see how things play out this next application cycle and if the numbers will look the same. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I don't remember if it was the woman in the video or you that just mentioned like diversity within the people that you chose to be involved in the Scholars Program.
Yes.
And I was wondering what exactly you mean by diversity, like within this group of people that you have in the school. Like, is it political ideologies? Like, what is the diversity?
Yes. So, of course, because diversity can mean a variety of things. The thing they have in common is their commitment to racial justice, because that's the mission of the program. That's the tie that binds and brings them together. But if you had those 10 in a room, you would see that they're very different. They are diverse in terms of age. So we have some who are right out of college. We have some who are kind of in the human sweat cat, or in their 30s. We have one who has been an assistant principal of a school actually right here in Houston. And so they are diverse in age, they're diverse in life experience. We have some who might be considered higher socioeconomic and some who are lower, so we have some socioeconomic diversity. I would suggest that we probably have some political diversity. I think, these are very strong-willed people with lots of opinions, and when we had the opportunity to get them together, you can see that there are differences of opinion in terms of ways in which, we may agree that this thing is an issue, but I might approach it this way, you may approach it that way. And I see that as a plus, because ultimately, in terms of solving these systemic issues, you're gonna have to have more than one way of thinking. And so that's the thing that I enjoy about the group. I suspect that will continue. I think there's also diversity in terms of institutions, like undergraduate institutions and law schools. So as I mentioned, we have students who are attending Ivy League institutions, Yale, Harvard, we have one at Berkeley, and then we have those who are attending state schools. We have individuals attending historically Black university law schools, and so they bring that perspective that's different, and the same for their undergraduate institution, and that's intentional. We want to make sure that we have students not just from all one school or one type of school, that they're from a variety of different institutional backgrounds.
Thank you. Adria,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Thank you all for coming. We've recorded the lecture so we can share it with your friends and colleagues who couldn't come. And really, really excited to know about this opportunity. And you may have some applicants in the house.
This would be great. And if there are any other questions, I'll stick around, so feel free to come forward. Thank you all. Have a great evening.